Good morning. Bonjour à tous au Canada et en dehors du Canada. I would like to acknowledge that the Africa Study Group is hosting this meeting from the traditional unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. Je tiens à souligner que le groupe de réflexion sur l'Afrique tient cette session virtuelle à partir du territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple Anishinaabe Algonquin. Bonjour encore une fois and good morning to everybody. As part of our series of discussion on governance and development challenges in Africa, we are discussing today the Zambia's presidential election held on August 13, 2021, where opposition leader Hakainde Hichilema secured a storming landslide victory over incumbent Edgar Lungu. I am Sheikh Bangura, the current president of Africa Study Group. This session will be moderated by Marsha Burdett, the deputy chair of the Africa Study Group. With a PhD in political sciences from Columbia University, New York, 1979, Marsha Burdett pursued an academic career followed by 25 years with Canadian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She has a long-standing interest in Africa, in particular, Central Southern Africa. Her book, Zambia, Between Two Worlds, and a series of articles focus on the major economical transition of the country when its new leaders embarked on the nationalization of the copper industry, the country's main economic engines. Subsequent articles deal with input industry for Zimbabwe agriculture sector in the 1980s and 1990s. I would like to inform you that this video will be on YouTube in the next day. Marsha, je vous passe la parole.
Thank you, Sheikh. As has been said, my name is Marsha Burdett. I'm the Deputy Director of the Africa Study Group. Just a short mention to you today that we will have one speaker, and that is Dr. Hakainde, and I will introduce him in just one moment. Let me say in French, my French is not great, but je m'appelle Marsha Burdett. Je suis le vice-présidente du groupe de réflexion de l'Afrique. So today's webinar is, as explained, part of a series about elections in Africa and electoral processes. This particular one is about the Zambian election held on August the 12th. Before we get into that, I just want to make one short comment, which I think is appropriate because it has to do with two important people for Zambia. And the first is to acknowledge the recent passing of Dr. Kenneth Kaunda. Now, as most of you know, Dr. Kaunda was the first president of the independent Zambia, and his actions in the political sphere extended over many years, but he was quite important in permitting the introduction of a multi-party democracy in Zambia, and he was very important in his decision to step down graciously in 1991 when he was defeated in an election. So he has recently passed away, but he's well remembered for the leadership he led in many ways in Southern Africa, including the anti-apartheid struggle, but we're looking particularly at political processes in Zambia today. The other mention is Professor Douglas Anglin. And Douglas was a Canadian, he recently passed away. He was a professor at the Carleton University for many years, But the importance for the Zambian connection is he was the vice president, the first vice president of the University of Zambia, and very important in setting up that key education institution for the new country of independent Zambia. So I just wanted to mention those two gentlemen. Now let me move on to our key speaker today. And just to say that, just 1 second before that, because our microphones are off except for the speakers and the panelists, if you have questions, put them into the chat function. And one of the things I will do during the session today is I will check that chat function from time to time and pick up any questions and pose them to Priva. So today's speaker is Privilege, but who likes to be known, Priva Hakainde, who holds a PhD in public policy from the Johnson Shirama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan, and a master's degree in political science and a bachelor's degree in philosophy. His research interest is in the role of transnational policy actor in driving policy changes in African institutions. He has taught political science in Canada and in Zambia, and has published in international reputed academic journals. He has served for several years as the governance and political advisor at the US Department of State and as a consultant with the African Development Bank. He currently doubles as the governance principal researcher for an Australian research incubator, pardon me, I didn't pronounce that well, and as development and pieces regional policy and advocacy coordinator for Saskatchewan and Kivu-Lipas. He will address the structural factors that determine electoral processes in Africa and the role of judiciary as well. I'd be interested in going over, very much interested in hearing from Dr. Hakainde in terms of his perspective on the change of government in this most recent contested election about Zambia and its other ramifications. Over to you, Priva.
Thank you very much, Masha, for that very generous introduction. And thank you for having me today. I'm really excited to delve into this conversation. So the last time I appeared on this platform, I spoke precisely about the role of institutions and exactly the role of the judiciary in democratic entrenchment in Africa. And I spoke about the role of the courts in adjudicating presidential disputes in Africa. Today, I come with a slightly tweaked topic. We just had an election in Zambia on the 12th of August, 2021. And in this election, the opposition United Party for National Development, headed by President Hakainde Hichilema, working with a number of alliance partners, smaller political parties, defeated the incumbent Patriotic Front and its leader, Edgar Lungu, who had enjoyed advantages of incumbency in circumstances where the electoral playing field was quite unfree and unfair by my own assessment, and indeed by the assessment of many observers. The election was characterized by electoral violence, that is well documented. The unfair application of the colonial piece of legislation called the Public Order Act from 1955, and the weaponization of the COVID-19 restrictions. So electoral violence resulted in deaths of officials and members of main political parties both before and on election day. So there was quite, a number of events that cumulatively could amount to a difficult electoral environment for that election. So as election results indicated, a landslide victory for opposition United Party for National Development, President Edgar Lungu declared that the election was neither free nor fair. He alleged that his, electoral observers in parts of the country had been prevented from taking part in the observation role. And he demanded that the Electoral Commission of Zambia should immediately stop the announcement of the results. But to its credit, the ECZ, or the Electoral Commission of Zambia, refused to succumb to pressure, while Lungu only conceded defeat following mediation by former President Rupia Banda and two other former presidents from different parts of Africa. One was Tanzania's Jakaya Kikwete, and the former Sierra Leone President Ernest Bai Koroma. So after that mediation, Lungu ensured a smooth handover of power, and President Hichilema, Hakainde Hichilema, was sworn in as Zambia's 7th president on the 24th of August this year. Now, the victory of an opposition party in Zambia has confounded many who had become accustomed to incumbents manipulating election results, and has shown that a large voter turnout and an effective election monitoring effort, supplemented by parallel voter tabulation by a variety of organizations, can indeed prevent, it can thwart attempts of electoral manipulation and fraud. That notwithstanding, there are still a number of questions as to what explains an opposition victory and the heavy defeat of an entrenched ruling party. So the UPND and other opposition parties, they hardly campaigned in this election. Their electoral participation was confounded by or characterized by lots of restrictions. They were prevented from, mobilizing. Overzealous police officers interrupted their activities. They fired the tear gas at them. And despite those restrictions and denial of permits to fly in the airspace from one part of the country to the other, so despite all these restrictions, Zambians recorded a record voter turnout of 71%, something really unprecedented, and it's the highest voter turnout since independence, since 1964. Some observers have even suggested that it was, by and large, a referendum on the performance of the Patriotic Front, its government, and President Lungu's unconstitutional pursuit of a third term, pressuring the Constitutional Court to deliver him a third term in office, despite clear constitutional provisions that anybody who has held office twice should not be elected into office. So, so the results could be said to have been a decisive rejection of the negative things of the Patriotic Front's decade in office, including the abuse of public resources, the high debt levels, impunity and lawlessness, and a terrible manifestation of cadreism and corruption in the system. So in spite of all that could be said about this election, the election of an opposition party in Zambia has become, this becomes the third peaceful transfer of power since 1991. It's not the first. You can count, there's been 3 different political parties unseating an incumbent government or political party in Zambia since 1991. And this has been heralded on the continent as a very rare phenomenon. Opposition leaders in the region are encouraged, many of whom attended the inauguration of President Hichilema. They're encouraged by the Zambia's political transition and the belief that they can draw valuable lessons on what happened in Zambia that is absent in many African countries. Just a couple of days ago, on the 21st of September, President Joe Biden, during the United Nations General Assembly, in his address, singled out Zambia's unprecedented electoral outcome and praised the youth and young people for their resounding resolve to choose a government of their choice through the ballot. So there are many questions that come to the fore. Indeed, Could this be understood as democratic consolidation in Africa, in Zambia, and in Africa in general? And will it be sustained over a longer term, in the long term, over a long period of time? So there are many analytical factors to tease out of this Zambian election. And I would like to set the stage for a discussion by highlighting 6 of them. But before I do so, I just want to throw out there several other areas that we could delve into and will not have time to look at in this conversation. Okay, so you can think about the role that the electoral monitors and the parallel voter tabulation played in this, in undermining electoral manipulation and fraud, for instance. That's one area that you could explore, and what that entails for electoral practice across Africa. The second issue you could look at that I'm not going to go deep into is, the explanation of the role of the high voter turnout, and especially the youth vote in the opposition victory, in ushering in an opposition political party in government. And also you could explain the position of women and women representation following such an election, both in the election and after the election. We could indeed interrogate the reasons for the record number of rejected ballots in Zambia. This past election saw more rejected ballots than the total number of voters for the opposition, all political parties of opposition put together, except the one that won the election and the incumbent Patriotic Front. The rest of them, there were 16 political parties taking part in this election. So the rejected number of voters was more than everything garnered or accumulated by the 14 political parties together. What explains that? Those are some of the important dynamics. Could it have been intentional? Could it have been accidental? Was there something structural to it? Was there a vacuum in terms of election education? Those are some of the important questions that could be discussed at a different level. The other interesting aspect is indeed to look at, to assess the future of the state-church relationship in Africa, and especially the politicization of religion and the notion of the unifying of the nation using religion in Africa. Those are some of the interesting issues that I will not be getting into deeply, but I would like to isolate specific issues that I want us to get into and discuss in a bit of detail. The first point I want to discuss is that this election tells a great story of democracy, but we should not rewrite the narrative. And I'm going to explain why I'm saying that. So while this was a momentous election that produced a resounding majority mandate for the opposition and an incredible story to tell about African democracy, like the story in Malawi also, where the courts in Malawi overturned the election because of fraud, even when international monitors and observers had endorsed the election as free and fair, the court said it was not. So this is a great story of democracy that is told in Africa. But we must also acknowledge that this election, and indeed even the Malawian election, were won against all odds. The opposition suffered lots of restrictions. They suffered police brutality. They suffered arrests, the denial of the use of the airspace, like I mentioned earlier, prevention from campaigning across the country. And I mentioned this specifically to underscore the power of the voters in Africa's emerging democracy. African democracy is emerging despite the breaks by the remnants of authoritarianism, despite the remnants of dictators. That democratic signal is emerging across Africa, and this election specifically points to that we must not rewrite the narrative. It was not all perfect, and despite all that, democracy is emerging in Africa, and examples are plenty. We can look at Malawi, you can look at Zambia, you can look at Kenya, for instance, also with the decision of the court a couple of years ago there. And we are hoping that this trajectory should be sweeping across the continent. We have an election coming up in Tanzania soon as well. So the second point I would like to mention is that, institutions matter. Okay, scholars have belabored the fact that institutions matter in democracy. So indeed they do matter, but when they stay or when they stand in the way of democracy, people can overrun institutions. People can overrun institutions. And Zambia is a typical example of where institutions had entrenched themselves in a particular way to favor a certain political outcome, and the people overran all that orchestration. People overrun institutions to produce a result that they themselves wanted, and not a result that was predetermined by an electoral environment that was couched and created by these institutions. The Electoral Commission of Zambia tried to rewrite the voters' roll, months before this past election. The voters' roll, which favored the incumbent, which over-registered voters in ruling Patriotic Front strongholds. They passed legislation, the legislature passed legislation to restrict the use of social media. And they even shut down social media on the voting day to prevent citizens from, providing checks and balances, from, announcing their voter tabulated results. They shut down the internet, they shut down the space for social media. Facebook, WhatsApp were inaccessible. They blocked the political mobilization of the opposition, specifically of President Hakainde Hichilema. They let smaller parties that have less impact on the voter on the electoral scene continue with their mobilization. They blocked President Hichilema. They tear gassed him. They even charged him with treason and imprisoned him in 2017 for over 5 months for an unbearable offense of treason. Okay, only to have been released after the mediation of the Commonwealth. So despite all this, they even institutionalized an ethnic verbal war to isolate him as a person of this particular ethnic group, and that his political party was predominantly mobilized only in that part of the country, and that this particular ethnic group was a terrible ethnic group that should never be allowed to get into office. Despite all that, institutions that championed all that were overrun by the citizens. Okay, so this is a test of institutionalism. Okay, when institutions do matter, but when the institutions stand in the way of democracy, they can be overrun by citizens. And that is a very good and important point to discuss going forward about the role of institutions in democratization, in the entrenchment of democratic development in Africa. The third point I'd like to make here is that Zambians and African voters have awakened to the importance of their rights over simplistic material appeasement. I think it is Amartya Sen, the Indian American scholar, economist and philosopher, who says that, who argues that even a prisoner could choose liberty over a lavish meal. Even a person who's close to starvation could choose their liberty over a lavish meal. Zambians in this election, and especially Zambian youth, chose freedom over benefits and handovers from corruption, which is a very common tactic used by a lot of incumbent leaders in Africa, in incumbent political parties, to go about a few days or a few months before elections to dish out money, to hand out all sorts of appeasements that would sway voters towards them. But in this election, we noticed that, and we observed that electorate value their liberties much more than they value those material appeasements. They received the material appeasements, but they voted otherwise. So the Patriotic Front dished out millions of Zambian kwacha and millions of dollars, even US dollars, as is beginning to be exhumed now post-electoral analysis, people being caught with millions and thousands and millions of kwacha and dollars in their homes that are suspected to have been partly part of this electoral process. But people received the aid and they voted otherwise. People value their freedoms much more than they value instant gratification. And although the ruling party ignored the fact that there was a sweeping wind of change in the country, the Zambian democracy in the last 5 years has shifted towards issues, towards liberty, and not transient benefits or bribery indeed. The fourth point I'd like to make is that diplomacy plays a key role in democratic entrenchment in Africa. And here, although I would like to speak also about the role of voter, electoral monitors and voter tabulation, I would like to address myself specifically to the role that was played by diplomacy as we know it in ordinary parlance. In 2019, President Lungu expelled the United States ambassador to Zambia, Daniel Foote, after a confrontation over human rights. After that, the US and the EU countries continued to defend human rights. A few days before elections, the US and the EU both issued very strong statements warning of sanctions for meddling with elections. If there was any proof that anybody had tampered with the electoral process, with the results, there were going to be sanctions. So these were important signs. There were important signs that the ruling party was beginning to panic in the last moment, and that they were potentially, going to meddle with the elections, with the result. There were whistleblowers that, brought credible evidence of such machinations. So I think this is a very important point, and especially for this discussion, that diplomacy works. I mentioned earlier that President Jakaya Kikwete and the president of Sierra Leone, former president of Sierra Leone, mediated the transition of power. They mediated, they spoke to Lungu, who had indicated claims of fraud and unfair practices, despite him, superintending over the institutions that he was accusing of having been fraudulent. So the role of diplomacy is very important here. And the point I want to make is that this is a call to the international cooperating partners and advanced democracies around the world to not relent on prioritizing support towards governance and democratic entrenchment in Africa. In the last 10 years or so, what we have seen is a shift from the support of democracy in Africa to the support in healthcare, to the support in infrastructure development, and very little and negligent support towards civil society strengthening, defending human rights defenders, support of opposition political parties in the expansion of their media, democratic space, mobilization, freedom to mobilize. So I think this is an important window of opportunity, and it's an important policy window indeed for the Western world, for the developed democracies, to rethink that attitude, that approach to supporting governance in Africa. It is important to support infrastructure. It is important to support healthcare, but there are direct dividends from supporting democratization, from supporting the expansion of freedom, from supporting mobilization of civil society organizations that translate into the strengthening of healthcare systems and indeed, accountability that reserves money for infrastructure development. So there's a bit of a bypass there by focusing only on infrastructure and on healthcare, that this democratic support is essential actually for the delivery of healthcare and also infrastructure development. So diplomacy indirectly supports the rule of law, which is a prerequisite for that economic growth and investment that we are supporting directly. The fifth point I would like to make, and perhaps finally, is that youth voters in Zambia now, and especially with the coming of the instrumentalization of social media, the youth voters, young voters, first-time voters are extremely ferocious and cruel to dictatorships. Any perception of dictatorial tendencies is confronted head-on, and you see it almost instantly on social media. It doesn't end at that level. The Patriotic Front undermined the role of social media. They labeled opposition United Party Development and UPND president particularly as a social media president. They did not realize that that would translate into actual votes. So youth voters are extremely tough on dictators. They turned up in graduation gowns. They turned up to vote in graduation gowns to protect the lack of employment, to protest the lack of employment rather, to protest that they are not being heard, their needs and their cry were not being heard. So they showed up in graduation gowns. They spent a night at polling stations, even if everybody knew that people would vote by 6 p.m. on the voting day. People queued up as early as 1 a.m. to cast their ballots the next day at 8 in the morning. A strong statement and a very symbolic gesture that they were getting intolerant, and they are indeed intolerant, and this is already beginning to emerge in terms of any kind of deviation from what they expected from President Hichilema. They again mobilize on social media and they make a statement. They will not take it any longer, and they hold him to account. So this is very important to notice, that young voters are instrumentalizing social media to really make strong political statements. Okay. So young voters are quite impatient. They are undesirous of intolerant governments. They are resolute about their freedoms. They want to see prosperity. They want to see the rule of law. They want to see the respect of divergent views in society. Young people will determine the democratic entrenchment in Africa, by my estimation, and their use of social media to advocate and to thwart corruption and to win traditionally complicit actors such as state police and even military that have been instrumentalized in the past for military coups and other undemocratic practices. This youth mobilization and use of social media will redirect the future of electoral practices in Africa. And it was indeed a referendum, as many people have termed it. I would like to end there. There's a point that I did not flesh out completely about the defiance of the theory of ethnic hegemony in democracy in Zambia, but also in Africa. We know that ethnicity has been instrumentalized both by ruling political parties, but also by the Western media to advance a narrative about division, about ethnic fighting. It has sometimes materialized without, not without the input of colonial influence. But this election also spelled out very clearly across ethnic divides that ethnicity cannot be used as a weapon against democratic freedoms, against the promotion of democracy. Those that dwelt on ethnicity, and it was indeed weaponized by the Patriotic Front, they went from one radio station to the next television station, isolating a particular region of the country, calling it names, because President Hakainde Hichilema, as opposition leader, then came from this part of the country with the hope that he would never garner votes anywhere else beyond this his regional area of originality. That was completely defied by this election. He won in his own region by a resounding margin, where he was getting, for instance, 40,000 votes in his own region where he comes from, and in his strongholds in the southern belt of the country. The ruling Patriotic Front was getting a marginal 1,000 or less votes. And where the opposition, where President Hakainde Hichilema lost in so-called Patriotic Front strongholds, President Hichilema was losing by a very narrow margin, and he even won several political parliamentary seats And even where the Patriotic Front was winning parliamentary seats, President Hichilema was winning the presidential vote. A clear statement that ethnicity, much as it is appreciated, cannot be used and galvanized to divide a people. And this hopefully should be a reverberating statement across Africa for future elections and democratic development. I would like to end there and allow for questions and conversations. Thank you very much.
Riva, thank you very much. You've given us lots to chew on, a very rich banquet of ideas and lots of information. I'll just pose a few questions, well, to get things rolling. One of them that I thought you might be able to tell us a bit more about is the access that civil society groups had in Zambia and observers to technological tools that allowed them to monitor and to publicize the outcome of the election, despite the opposition from the central government and its shutting down of the social media networks. Can you tell us a little bit more how that unrolled? And I guess the question would be whether this kind of possibility was possible in Zambia because of a particular set of people who are reskilled, or whether this is something that could be used in other African countries.
Thank you, Masha. And that's a really important question. So I discussed the Zambian election as an event as it happened on that particular day. But I also alluded to a few things that happened prior to that, including the voter registration. So I think one of the important things about this election was the attempts by the Electoral Commission of Zambia to rewrite the voters' roll. But it is very hard to change the narrative, to change the way things are done for this particular election, to divert completely from what has been done in the past. So civil society organizations and other political observers were very vigilant, despite the efforts to exclude them from the processes of monitoring and playing the watchdog role on this process of electoral monitoring of voter registration. They still somehow managed to observe the registration process. They managed to acquire voters' rolls. They managed to disperse their observers across the country, and especially along the borders with our neighboring countries like Malawi. There were accusations of Malawians coming to vote. The Patriotic Front had apparently gone in to mobilize Malawians along the border to come and vote. I have no proof of that. But suffice to say, there was a lot of vigilance. And when there's a bit of suspicion that something is being hidden, they become even more vigilant. So I think what helped was, first of all, the access to the voters' roll. Even if the ECZ, the Electoral Commission of Zambia, refused to have that voters' roll audited by an independent auditor to determine if there were ghost voters on the roll. So I think that continued persistence, and pushback against the Electoral Commission of Zambia's skirmishes, it helped. The other thing that helped was, the distribution of poll watchers at every polling station. So even if the system tried to limit the number of people who could be using COVID restrictions, who could be present at the polling station, the opposition political parties and specifically the UPND and its alliance partners were so solidly organized and mobilized that they were able to disperse thousands of electoral monitors, poll watchers, who were present at every one of the more than 5,000 polling stations across the country. And the electoral system is set up in such a manner that when the counting is finished, and in fact, the counting is done in the presence of the monitors, the moment the counting is finished, the opposition poll watchers would transmit that result directly to the opposition core center or command center, where they would then, tabulate the result. So if the Electoral Commission of Zambia attempts to announce anything different than what was sent through that channel, then they will be challenged to that. And that this indeed happened on the first day when the ECZ attempted to announce the results of a poll of a constituency called Feira in Lusaka province, which had not been confirmed. You know, an MP, a member of parliament, who was the chairperson of the elections of his political party, Gary Nkombo, to name him, he stood up and challenged that result. And he said, you cannot announce that figure. It is wrong. That's not what we have. We have the same result that was announced at the polling station, that was announced at the constituency level. And what you're announcing now is different from what we have. And because there was so much, the tempers were high, the environment was tense. The Electoral Commission of Zambia could not afford to proceed with that announcement. They had to reverse it immediately. And that sent a signal that everything else to be announced after this must conform to what was announced elsewhere in the country. So I think that distribution of poll watchers across the country, even if the internet was shut, they could send text messages, using the local mobile phones, and the numbers could be totaled at their own command center and could be, compared to what was, to be announced by the Electoral Commission of Zambia. A couple of times attempts were made to announce a different result, and it was stopped by the vigilance of the opposition political parties. Yeah.
Yes, it's very interesting. And you're right. I mean, it was only possible with a really vigilant and well-organized civil society and other political parties. One of the questions that's come in on the system is a question dating back to, or looking at the constitutional issues around the efforts by Lungu to extend his term in office by saying, I gather the challenge was that his first term was initiated by the death of President Sata, so he didn't really have 2 complete terms in office. And the questioner wants to know how then was Lungu actually permitted to run in this election? Was it due to corruption, or was there some constitutional indecision surrounding his ability to run for a 3rd term?
Another very important question. I think I would say this, even if I was to stand before the Constitutional Court in Zambia, that the decision to allow him to run for a 3rd term was flawed. It was based on judicial corruption. Lungu appointed all the judges of the Constitutional Court, who prior to the ruling that they made on his eligibility, had refused to determine whether or not he was eligible. They used jargon to dismiss the case and said his eligibility was neither here nor there because it was not before the courts of law. But I want to make a very technical distinction here, a very technical point. The Constitution of Zambia, as amended in 2016, specifically Article number 106, A and B, read together, clearly make a distinction between a term of office and holding office. Okay, President Lungu's supporters, they promoted a narrative that he had not held a full term of office twice. He had not, in 2015, he was elected president after the death of Michael Sata, who was, Lungu was the defense minister and home affairs minister to Michael Sata. So we had a snap election in 2015 that ushered him for a short term of 1.5 years of office. So the argument here was that because that period of time that he held office could not be, and the Constitution says a term of office is 3.5 years. Okay, let's settle that. So a term of office is considered 3.5 years according to the Zambian Constitution. So because Edgar Lungu was in office for 1.5 years, it was not a term of office according to that narrative. Okay, but the distinction here is, or the point here is that 3.5 years is an argument for somebody who became a president because the one who held office prior to him was a vice president who could not succeed a deceased president. Okay, we have a running mate system where a president is elected along with a running mate. Supposing the president dies in office and the running mate is supposed to assume office, and they are ineligible to, they're not eligible to assume office. The person who is elected on that basis is supposed to, that 106A specifically, addresses itself to that. But the point that the Constitutional Court was missing is that the Constitution is very unambiguous, that it's not about, that the 3.5 years, 1.5 year is an argument about somebody that took over office because of, a vice president was not eligible. And Lungu was not elected like that. Lungu was not elected because his vice president was not, Michael Sata's vice president was not eligible. The point that they were missing is that the Constitution very unambiguously says anybody who holds office twice is not eligible to run for office. And the mischief there, according to constitutional scholars in Zambia, is that somebody could claim to have held office, the term of office is 5 years. If somebody holds office for 4.9 years and decides to resign, then they can continue to claim to run for office for many, many consecutive times, as we have seen in other dispensations like Russia. So that is the argument of constitutional scholars. And that's why the Constitution makes it very clear that actually it is holding office twice and not a term of office. A term of office, the argument of the term of office is something else. It's not about eligibility. Eligibility is determined by how many times you have held office. And that's the Constitutional Court refused to answer that question. They dodged the question and they never addressed themselves that question at all. So they continued to peddle along the lines of the term of office and not holding office twice. And they even disputed in front of cameras. They went before cameras and said President Lungu did not hold office twice. Confronted as to what he was doing in office between 2015 and 2016, absolutely no answer. It was an irrational kind of argument. So indeed, the Constitutional Court's decision to let President Lungu run for a third time was irregular, it was illegal, and I think this is going to be an issue to be addressed post this election as to whether or not those judges had an illegal, made an illegal decision, whether or not they should be maintained or they should be purged. There was, after all, an argument that they were unqualified to hold that office. They were appointed to those offices because of patronage and because of allegiance to President Lungu. And I think he foresaw this argument coming and wanted to secure himself a third time to run in office. And Zambians rejected that, as they rejected President Chiluba's attempts to run for a third term in the 1990s, 2000 actually. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting legal explanation, and thank you for that. One of the other members has put forward a question about the role women have played in the development of more effective politics in Zambia. Could you address that?
Sure, thank you. So I think this election, despite all the positive things we could say about it, performed poorly in terms of women participation. Out of the 156 seats in parliament, there's only 20 members of parliament, women members of parliament. That's a very, very negligible number of representation from the women folk. President Hakainde Hichilema has attempted to narrow that gap, although he could have done better by appointing more. He has a window to nominate 8 other members of parliament, apart from those that are elected during the election. And he only appointed 2 women out of 8 that he nominated. And many of us think it was a lost opportunity. He could have used that window to nominate more women and appoint them into parliament to beef up the to close up the gap that resulted from the election. But there are some good messaging there. There's some good developments. For the first time in the history of the country, we have a woman speaker in a National Assembly, and we have a woman deputy speaker in the first deputy speaker in the National Assembly, which is really important. We also have a woman vice president. The running mate to the president was a woman. That's not an advancement per se, because the previous vice president was also a woman. But we are hoping that President Hakainde Hichilema is going to appoint more women into significant decision-making positions in his government. He still has lots and lots of positions to appoint. He has only made a marginal appointment so far. So we still hope that there's room for improvement. But in terms of elected office, this election was not a good reflection in terms of the participation of women, despite the fact that women are the majority voters in the country. I don't have the figures for the local government elections, but there are a number of women who won the elections at local government as mayors, council chairpersons, and as councillors around the country. I don't have the figures right off the cuff, but I do think that this election did a disfavor to women by not fielding more women in parliamentary positions, and by President Hakainde Hichilema not appointing an equitable number of women for that slot that he had to nominate 8 women. Yeah, so that's what I could say about that, and I hope that going forward there's going to be more aggression in appointing women to points of decision, position of decision making.
Thank you. One other issue which I think it would be very interesting to hear you elaborate, and this touches on the youth question that you raised in your presentation, but it takes it to another angle, which is the economic challenges facing Zambia, which are quite massive right now. And if we're thinking about what the youth were saying, they were very much in opposition to corruption, but they're also, I think, in opposition to bad economic governance of the country, and from what I've been reading. So I'd be interested in hearing if you have any comments on how this new UPND government will try to deal with the enormous economic challenges facing Zambia.
I think that the most important piece about this economic challenge facing Zambia is to have a positive, image in the international community. One of the biggest challenges we had with President Lungu was our perception internationally was bad. That reflected poorly on investment portfolios in the country. It reflected badly on our huge debt burden, with the mostly commercial debt internationally. It reflected very poorly in terms of many other macro and micro indicators locally, domestically. So I think the first and most important part of this is to see Zambia positively reflected on the international scene. And we have seen this already. For the first time since 1992, President Hakainde Hichilema was at the White House yesterday. I'm the first Zambian president to be at the White House since 1992, invited to speak, side by side with Vice President Kamala Harris. We heard President Biden single out Zambia in his address to to UNGA, the United Nations General Assembly. We have seen a positive, narrative of Zambia since he won the election. That in itself could translate into very important dividends, economically, domestically, for the Zambian economy. Its debt portfolio has better chances of restructuring. We have better chances of investment, and specifically in the mining sector, in agriculture, in manufacturing. So we are hoping to, and that I think is going to have a big impact on those areas. The second piece of this is, and this is something that the international community must support. President Hakainde Hichilema has embarked on a narrative of accountability and transparency and the rule of law in the managing of national affairs. That must be supported so that is translated into the recovery of stolen assets. It must translate into a different political culture. I know that could have negative connotations by some folks, but as political scientists like the term political culture. So I'm hoping that this would translate into a different political culture within the country, a culture of accountability with our institutions and among Zambians themselves. And that in itself will be very important in advancing significant economic gains when the little that is collected locally is accounted for, is utilized to the maximum benefit of the citizens. And everybody knows that you cannot cut corners anymore. Graft is taken care of. People are prosecuted for their wrongs. That is important for the advancement or reversing of this the economic fortunes of the country and the benefit of citizens from that reversal itself. So I think those are some of the important things that should be done immediately. Almost those don't take long to do. I mean, already, investigating wings are confiscating huge and incredibly huge amounts of money from the allies of President Lungu. The new government has moved in to prevent the pillaging of the environment, where ministers and senior government officials, including justices of high courts and Supreme Court and Speaker of the National Assembly, had encroached into water reserves to pillage the forests and apportion themselves huge portions of land to build mansions for themselves. That has been stopped, has been prevented. And I think once the international community sees this firmness on the rule of law, on accountability, then we are destined for better outlook and better investment and better performance of the economy. The Kwacha was the worst performing economy at some point. Soon after the election, it was third or fourth best performing currency on the international market. So I think those are good indicators, and they must be promoted and supported.
Yes, I think there's lots of challenges out there, and challenges to the international community as well as to the Zambian government and the new government. One final question that over the reading about the Zambian economy over the last number of years, and of course, my own research had been years ago into the mining sector, I'm always interested with the role of China, which is now a big actor on the international stage, but a very important actor in many African countries. It's not directly in the question of the Zambian election, but perhaps you could make some comments about what you might see as the continuing role or perhaps different role of China for the future of Zambia.
Thanks, Masha. Yeah, that's another really good question. I think, like you said, China plays a really important role, world over. It's an economic powerhouse globally. But I think that there could be better opportunities from the relationship with China if they are engaged in a better way than they have been engaged in the past. The bulk of Zambian debt, foreign debt, is with the Chinese, and it's all shrouded in secrecy. Non-disclosure clauses, which defy the whole doctrine of accountability of a government to its own citizens. So in my view, I think that's an important area of engagement going forward as to how the Zambian government should better engage with the Chinese partners, in a way that is transparent and that can be communicated to the public, to the citizens of the country. President Hakainde Hichilema has promised that he's going to pass the the Access to Information Bill, which has been sitting and gathering dust on the shelf for a long time. If that is passed, it's going to demand that people have access to some of government's commitments internationally, for instance. And the Chinese counterparts cannot continue to engage with Zambia and with Africa advancing non-disclosure clauses in commitments, where countries' taxpayers' money is put and is at risk. So I think that's a good opportunity there. The other opportunity is really the whole issue of transparency in dealing with the Chinese government. We understand they have their sacrosanct disposition to non-interference in democracy, in governance systems of their partner countries bilaterally. And that can never change. It's just an entrenched perspective of China, but they have meddled in Zambian elections in different ways. In advancing corruption, in cutting corners with government, procurement systems, where they are getting a contract to build a road worth $1 million, and they are, inflating for a cost of $20 million, knowing very well that the difference is going to be pocketed by government officials. I think Zambia's problems cannot be isolated from its engagement with China. The corruption that we've seen in the last several years, even where we have acquired commercial loans like the Eurobond, and have gone ahead to get a Chinese contract to build a road or to provide a service of one kind or the other. We have seen huge corruption taking place there. We have seen lots of pilferage, which is necessitated by this whole lack of transparency between the engagement between Chinese counterparts and Zambian counterparts. And this cuts across Africa. I have had a lot of interest in Sino-Africa relations for a long time. So I think there's an opportunity there. I am not sure how much China would be amenable to the restructuring of that debt, but I think that there is need for better engagement, for more transparent engagement, and there's also need to be a bit firm when dealing with Chinese counterparts. We can get the best out of them if we negotiate better deals with them and not lay ourselves, just make ourselves available for manipulation and for abuse, and to allow ourselves to be corrupted and to corrupt ourselves by the opportunity provided by the lack of transparency. So I do think that there's a lot of opportunity there, and I hope China will play a more significant role in advancing responsible governance, responsible investment, and in a transparent way that benefits both the people of China and the African people at large.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your discussion today of the Zambian election and wider Zambian implications, regional implications. Very much appreciated. I'm just going to give you a minute or two, if you would like to do any final summary comments, if you would like. Otherwise, we can just thank you very much for your participation and turn back to Sheikh. I mean, would you like to say anything final as a wrap up, Priva?
No, thanks, Masha. I really appreciate this opportunity to address these important questions, and I will remain available to, for future discussions. Thank you to Sheikh and to both of you indeed for this incredible opportunity, and I hope that this discussion has provided a bit of food for thought for all of us in Africa, and the prospects for democracy in Africa as a large.
So, Sheikh, do you want to do a final conclusion of?
Yes, merci Marcia, merci Priva for your excellent presentation. As you say, we were not able to cover all the issues of these elections. We know that there are many more to be said, and we hope that we will get some other opportunities to have a deep analysis of what this election will have as consequences. So we will have future-oriented vision to come back to you and to some other partners to continue our discussion on election processes in Africa. Before closing, I just wanted to draw your attention and the attention of our audience that the Africa Study Group has learned the unexpected passing of Justice Irene Mambilima. She was a former Chief Justice and former Chair of the Electoral Commission of Zambia. And she was also a board member of Electoral Justice, of the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa. And it's important for us to mention it because I spoke to Justice Mambilima last year, and we had agreed that after the election, she will be a member for one of our panel to discuss the election. Unfortunately, she passed away. And Justice, on behalf of many friends, and I trust that I will be speaking on behalf of many Zambian Canadian friends, and also of international election observers who work with him, with her. We would like to, Africa Study Group, would like to extend our condolences to her family and the people of Zambia. Merci, je voudrais remercier le CIC, le Conseil international canadien, de nous avoir accommodés, de nous avoir gracieusement permis d'utiliser, de continuer à utiliser ces facilités. Je voudrais remercier Sam, qui est chargé de la communication et qui s'est personnellement engagé. Je sais qu'il nous écoute, il est de l'autre côté. Il est chargé de la communication du CIC, la branche nationale d'Ottawa. À côté de lui, nous savons qu'il y a eu Christiana, qui nous a beaucoup aidés. Et personnellement, je voudrais remercier Mafoya, qui est le chargé de la communication du Canadien, du groupe de réflexion pour l'Afrique, donc notre collègue. Et merci à toi, Marsha, pour avoir présidé cette session de façon excellente. Et merci à tout le monde. Et je voudrais vous rappeler que notre prochaine session, notre prochain webinaire, ça sera pour le 30 septembre. Et nous nous pencherons sur la brûlante question de l'impact de la violence extrémiste et du terrorisme en Afrique. Nous aurons deux excellents intervenants qui vont nous parler et qui vont discuter avec nous pendant 90 minutes. Et j'espère que tout le monde sera là. Et aussi, je vous rappelle que cette session est en direct sur YouTube et elle continuera à y rester pour le reste du temps. Merci à tout le monde de votre participation et je vous souhaite une bonne journée. Au revoir.